Welcome to Means of Grace, a podcast produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church.
Greetings, friends. My name is Ken Carter, and I'm honored to serve as the bishop of the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church. We're in the season of Lent, and a number of us are reading the spiritual classic, Life Together by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. We've gathered online. We're in contact with each other weekly. We'll gather again on the Wednesday evening of Holy Week, the first Wednesday in April. I want to share with you just a little bit about who Dietrich Bonhoeffer was and about what this life together means for us. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was born in 1906 in Breslau, Germany. He was born to an accomplished and privileged family. His father was a psychiatrist. His mother's family came from aristocracy. He had a twin sister, and they were the sixth and seventh of 8 children. His mother was also a teacher, and she educated all of the children, much as Susanna Wesley did, or John and Charles. The mother was more religious than the father. The children, as they grew up, excelled academically. One brother was a chemist, another was the chief legal counsel for Lufthansa Airlines. At 14 years old, Dietrich announced that he would become a minister. His entry into university coincided with the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi movement. Bonhoeffer studied at Tübingen and Berlin under Karl Barth, the theologian, among others, and he wrote his PhD thesis on the nature of the church. He then served a small German-speaking congregation in Barcelona, Spain. And then he came to the United States for a year, where he studied at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. That was 1930. This was during the Great Depression, and he encountered for the first time racism against Black persons. He attended that year for worship the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. He loved the preaching of the Black church, the music, the energy. At Union Seminary, one of his professors was Reinhold Niebuhr. Bonhoeffer came to see the need to integrate his thought with his actions. He also deepened his empathy for those who were suffering in the United States and later when he returned to Germany. After returning home, he taught and served a small church, and he did ecumenical work. He was a popular teacher who would often meet with his students in pubs, and he would often pick up the tab. Through the 1930s, the Nazi movement grew stronger. Criticism of the government was outlawed, and an anti-Semitic agenda was enforced. Jews were banned, for example, from civil service. Someone in Bonhoeffer's family married a person of Jewish descent who then died. Bonhoeffer declined to take part in the memorial service, a compromise he later regretted. The German church had historically been loyal to the state, God, and country. Bonhoeffer would increasingly see himself in solidarity with the Jews. He saw Christianity and Nazism as irreconcilable. At the same time, the Catholic Church of his country signed a treaty with the German government. Many wanted to remove the Old Testament from the Bible because it was the story of the Jewish people. Bonhoeffer felt increasingly alone. He wrote in a letter about that. He said, "I found myself in radical opposition to all my friends. All this frightened me and shook my confidence, so that I began to fear that dogmatism might be leading me astray, since there seemed to be no particular reason why my own view in these matters should be any better, any more right than the views of many really good and able pastors, whom I sincerely respect. And so I thought it was about time to go into the wilderness for a spell. And that's what Bonhoeffer would do. He would describe this period in his life in the wilderness. And Lent is really, for us, a wilderness. So Bonhoeffer went briefly to London, England, to clear his thinking and to figure out his life in the wilderness. In England, he worked with the refugees who were fleeing his own home. And upon his return to Germany, he always felt the need to go back home. He saw that there were two options: the state church and the confessing church. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was asked to be the director of a seminary, a school, to train confessing church pastors in Finkenwald, a remote town in Germany. At this seminary, a very simple school they put together, they focused on the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 through 7, which would later become his book, The Cost of Discipleship. The community that was there ate together. They did chores, they played music, they took walks, they studied. In that context, he would write the book Life Together that we're studying. 5 groups of about 25 people each went through this 2-year course. Bonhoeffer described it as the most fulfilling period of his life. In 1935, the confessing church that Bonhoeffer taught and led was declared illegal. For example, it was illegal to have intercessory prayers in a church service to pray for other people, because this was a way people were communicating that their friends and family members were in trouble and were being harmed. It meant that pastors could be arrested. The persecution intensified, and many pastors spent time, sometimes years, in concentration camps. In the next years, pastors were required to swear an oath to Hitler. Bonhoeffer continued to train people in a kind of underground church. In 1938, the synagogues were destroyed and Jewish businesses were looted. Bonhoeffer grew despondent over the role of the church and that the church did not seem to have a voice. He connected with a movement that planned to assassinate Adolf Hitler. He weighed the risk and the implications and the benefits. And he began a double life. And his rationale was to alleviate the suffering as an answer to Christ's call. Some of his thinking during this period is in his book, Ethics. Bonhoeffer smuggled people out of Germany. He had a romantic relationship with a woman, mostly by correspondence. In 1943, he was imprisoned. He was stripped of all of his possessions, even his Bible, and then he was placed in solitary confinement. When the officers discovered that his father was a famous psychiatrist, his conditions improved. He was given back his Bible. He was given better coffee. He was able to write letters, and he was able to take walks outside. The letters he wrote during this time in his life became letters and papers from prison. Bonhoeffer contemplated committing suicide. He developed a daily ritual, and he used, interestingly for us in North Carolina, he used the Moravian daily text. And he kept the church calendar: Advent, Christmas, Epiphany, Lent, Easter. He was in prison for 18 months. Bonhoeffer came to see that Christianity needed to connect to the real world in which we live and its suffering, and not to avoid it. He was in prison for 18 months, and after another plot to kill Adolf Hitler backfired because it failed, the opposition to him became stronger. He was hanged in April of 1945, just 2 weeks before the United States liberated Germany. Bonhoeffer is remembered as a person of intellectual strength, of great character, and of deep faith, who did not avoid the consequences required of us in the face of injustice. The best recent biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer is by Charles Marsh, entitled Strange Glory. I'd encourage you to avoid the biography by Eric Metaxas. It has been regarded universally by Bonhoeffer scholars around the world as not being an accurate representation of who Bonhoeffer is. Some of what I've shared, I've drawn from a wonderful book by Nancy Keene, who teaches at Harvard Business School. She's a woman of Christian faith, about 5 different leaders: Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, Rachel Carson, and Bonhoeffer, and especially her chapter on Bonhoeffer. I encourage you to continue reading Life Together during this season. And thank you for listening to this podcast and for viewing this conversation.
Thank you for listening to Means of Grace, a podcast produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church. We hope you enjoy listening to these podcasts and use them as a way to stay connected to our community. Remember to subscribe to Means of Grace for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please leave us an honest rating and a review. It helps others find this podcast. Follow the WNCC on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at WNCCUMC. Once again, that's at WNCCUMC. Means of Grace is produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church and Andy Go of Gojo Studios.